Crazyhouse chess fans, it's GM Max here. I was a top 10 player in Crazyhouse in the past, and now I'm sharing with you my secrets of what exactly are the best ways to play Crazyhouse and to advance the theory of this wonderful and beautiful variant. And for this, I'm actually going to show you a very cool game played by JannLee, that is Justin Tan, who is the best player in Crazyhouse for many, many years. I think from, I'm not sure how long exactly, but certainly he was the world champion in 2016 and I think also 2017 in Crazyhouse, and still a very, very strong player rate over 2,700 to this day. So in this game we see the Alekan defense, and most often you're going to see why I play knight c3 and kind of allow black to transpose back into an improved version of the e4, e5 openings if they wants to, which I mentioned in my Crazyhouse openings 1e4 video. For those who haven't checked it out yet, you may find that useful. In any case, let's focus on the move e5 that was played in the game, where it's sort of a point that you normally aren't going to see black play it the way they would in a normal Alekan in normal chess, but instead they will typically sacrifice a knight with knight c6 and d5, saying that they will get very easy development if white were to take the knight. So JannLee plays d4, and I know from my own experience playing these positions against JannLee with black that he is very, very strong in these strategic lines. He has had a very good feel for the piece placement. He just goes knight e2, castles knight c3, and just makes it very hard for black to get any sort of counterplay. But instead black played a6, and of course a6 isn't a particularly common move, but after that last note we can kind of see that the idea is to prepare d5 without allowing bishop to b5. So JannLee decides to go out and try and punish the move order by playing the move ef6, and after ef6 then playing the move d5 himself. It's also worth pointing out that one interesting novelty is, at least at a high level, is to play knight at d5 and say, well, I don't care if you drop a pawn on e6, because at least that pawn is not going to bother me in the future, and I can sort of develop my pieces normally with a good game from there. It's only possible to play like this, but I think that d5 is definitely the most principled move, just taking the space advantage. And black played the move knight to e5 at this point, deciding not to sort of risk a bishop to b4 move. And now the move bishop e2 is played, and you can see that white is playing very steadily, kind of knowing that, okay, compared to the free ef6 lines, black has not managed to get the pawn on d5 himself, and that means that white basically is able to use his space advantage, well, just to kind of leave black without a lot of active play. So black played knight to c5, and white decided to develop normally here. I mean, if I was white, I'd be very tempted by a move like knight to h5 or knight to f5. Kind of with the same idea in each case, that if black were to castle, well, we could go knight g7 and just rip open the black king. Now, if the more dynamic positions, you're actually often going to see black not take on g7, instead use the tempo to try to do some sort of attack. But in this particular case, black doesn't really have serious attacking chances. Of course, keep in mind knight g4 is covered by the bishop. And also, white's not even really sacking anything, because after d4 you are getting the piece back, and, well, if you get the knight, you can even drop it on h5, which is pretty annoying for black. So, it turns out probably the position is not as bad as I had thought. That maybe this position is still kind of playable for black, because somehow, with only a bishop, if white does play bishop h6, he can win the exchange. But then the black king gets very safe, and instead it's probably better just to keep the initiative and to just develop normally and wait for your chances in the middle game. Well, the move knight c3 is sort of a more, I think, indicative of JannLee's approach, where he just has a very good feel for the positions in general in Crazy, like a very good feel for the attack, a very solid and strong defender as well, and well, certainly his ideas and his channel on YouTube about Crazyhouse will definitely greatly help other players to kind of follow in his footsteps and for the best players to stand on his shoulders. So the game went d6. White now played knight e4. Kind of an interesting concept to try to keep the knight in reserve. I mean, to me, knight h5 would be a lot more natural. I mean, I think in this case, after castles, that black is probably doing quite well. Because I think it's kind of not worth it to spend all these tempi just to have taken the bishop. That was my first conclusion, but it's maybe not quite that simple. Because after knight h5, knight can be useful just to have the material in hand for an attack later. You never know. I think that black probably didn't defend this position in the best way. I think actually this position, if you do want to really challenge yourself, you might like to try and see if you can defend better than opperwezen did in this game. Given that I broadcast opperwezen, I kind of showed one of his wins yesterday. Well, it kind of makes sense to look at from the other side as well of a game that he lost. So in this position, I think that his move bishop f5, well, it's not the worst move in this position. I think it kind of gives white what he wants. And I think that instead, a move like rook e8 is probably more natural, because it means that if white, for example, were to play knight takes g7, and you can drop a pawn on h6, but it doesn't really do all that much if the king just moves away. But a better move for white is probably to play a move like pawn at g5, and I think this was JannLee's idea with playing knight e4, that he wanted to support the attack on the dark squares here. But I'm not sure if it's actually that effective, because black might put a knight on g4, maybe even knight to g4 just normally. It's not so clear, because now we see the idea of why it's important to play rook e8 to have this attack. It's still a very sharp position, and definitely we could analyze a lot deeper. My current conclusion is I think after takes, and bishop at h4, that white does have quite a strong attack. I feel like practically the position is at least a lot easier for white to play, even if probably objectively black can defend it still. Maybe knight at f5 or knight g6 is one way to kind of hold on the dark squares. Or even king h8 can be a good prophylaxis just to anticipate gf6 so that it doesn't come with a check. Anyway, also the move queen e7 is the other attempt, which kind of has similar ideas after takes. Well, now if white goes pawn at g5, I think it's a lot less effective in this version, because now black can sort of just take and... after bishop takes g5, black can now play f6, and we see why it might be better to have the rook on f8 rather than on e8, because you kind of don't really mind if they take on f6, because you just get two very useful minor pieces, and an attack on f2 at the end of the recaptures, which is pretty cool. White is, of course, probably not going to play knight g7 immediately, or if he is, probably he'll play it a little bit differently. But I think that, it is a position where probably white is still better, but at least the game does kind of go on from here. There are definitely a lot of candidates for white, that's for sure. In any case, the game saw bishop f5, and after knight takes c5, the sack on f6 was kind of interesting as well, but I think that JannLee's approach is better. But in this position, I think that it does make more sense to play knight takes g7, and after king g7, the idea is actually not so much to go bishop at h6, because again, it's sort of a point that black's often quite happy to give up the exchange to get rid of an annoying diagonal piece, and also to kind of be able to safeguard his king with the queen. So instead, I think it's better to keep that in reserve with knight f6 and keep them guessing as to whether we'll put the pawn or the bishop on this square. It's not that easy for black to avoid the exchange, and if he does take, well, again, is like putting a knight on h5 later. You're probably going to castle first because the king is not so safe in the center. But black doesn't have a lot of great drops, and also white can just sort of just pile on the dark squares, and it'll be very hard for black to defend in that case. Instead, white played knight f3, and okay, it's true this game is one that perhaps not objectively the most accurate, but certainly quite a fun game for sure, with actually even a nice king hunt near the end. So after knight takes f3, we had bishop takes f3, and actually here black missed a very nice tactic, in fact, in this position, where he played a move rook e8 that sort of gave white the time to defend, but at this point, it's sort of the point that very often the c2 square and c7 squares can also be a sort of sore point for both sides in the different openings. And here too, we see bishop take c2, and then if white were to take that, there was a mouse slip there. Well, then knight at d4 is very strong. We see the idea is simply to drop a knight on c2, pick up the rook, and also keep the king in the center. In fact, the computer believes that the best option is actually to play, to just give up the queen here and play some move like bishop to d3, and kind of sort of get a knight and sort of try to safeguard the king that way. Or an even more radical suggestion, which is very blitz bullet style, is to play castles and just sort of sack the queen, and then play like knight g7 and just go for the attack sort of with a piece in hand. Of course, the position is very chaotic and it's kind of hard to analyze to a final conclusion. My feeling is that given that knight at h4 can be met with knight bishop at e4, and that white can combine the attack and defense quite well, I feel like white should be doing quite fine here, but of course the position remains very complex and anything can happen after a move like knight d4, for example. Again, we see black not taking the knight because it actually helps to kind of cover the king from an attack here. Well, instead black played rook to e8, and well, white played bishop to e3. Bishop at e3 feels a bit sort of superfluous to some extent, but I guess the point is that if you do play bishop e3, well, still black can kind of go for this bishop takes c2 and knight d4 idea that we saw before. And also bishop at e3 kind of takes some of the sting out of rook takes e3 when you can take with bishop rather than a pawn. Okay, to be fair, opperwezen did see the tactic on a second chance with bishop c2. And indeed in this position, actually, JannLee again showed his great understanding of Crazyhouse and played the move of castles here. Actually, it's worth knowing that in this position, maybe instead of the normal knight c2, it might actually be better not to play for material, but instead to go for the initiative and the attack on white's king, where a move like knight takes f3 takes. And then pawn at g2, I think, is very unpleasant for white, actually. Because if you leave that pawn there, all it's going to take is for black to get a rook or a queen in hand, and he's basically going to win the game. And also bishop at g6 kind of a big threat to get more material in hand. But if you play bishop king takes g2, I think that bishop to g6 or even knight at h4 is going to be incredibly unpleasant for white. I mean, you don't really want to allow some drop on g2. Something like, let's say, king g1, pawn at g2, I think is just winning for black. But if you play king g3, then there's bishop at g6, and we kind of see again that black is sort of recycling the material in hand. Position is very, very complicated, where the engine gives this very crazy line of going knight to g4, with the idea that if you take, there's going to be some sacks, like jumps on h6 are going to cause problems, for example. And yeah, I mean, position is one that, well, kind of has to be, I think, calculated, but I think that bishop takes h5 probably is the right move, where it allows you to kind of guard yourself on the light squares, and, well, if knight h6, you can always ignore the knight when move like king h8, saying this is defended. And that's probably the most practical move in the position, even though the computer thinks g takes h6 is fine. Well, I guess in this case, like, probably it turns out that white doesn't quite have enough for the attack, where it really helps a lot that in this position, white doesn't have knight f5 check, because if white knight f5, the position might be winning for white, but after king takes h4, I think then this position, probably just pawn at g5 should be good enough, because king at h5, pawn at g6 sort of forces the king back. And after king g3, yeah, it's, well, still an incredibly unclear position. It feels like there should be some sort of mate for black, but I don't see it. And to kind of find the computer thinks the best line is actually to play something like pawn at g6, and it gives the best outcome as being a draw with takes. And so I'm saying that neither side has a really great way to get out of this perpetual check, as it were. Well, I'm not sure if I agree with that necessarily, but okay, actually it probably is true, given that king h8 is running in a bishop c5 with a check. But I guess black could go king h8 if you want to try and keep the game going. And actually I don't really see a good way for white to follow up the attack. But I mean, the fact that black's king is a lot safer than white's king suggests to me that this is probably going to be winning for black with best play. Or at the very least, black has the advantage in this position. Well, black played knight c2, and well, after knight g7, we see that this is where the attack kind of comes for white. And you can't really leave it either, because if you let the knight get to f5, like ideas like knight at h6 and pawn at g7 mate is a problem. And even just taking the rook with knight e8 is a big threat. So at pawn at g7, and now a very creative move by JannLee in e7, with the point that you're pairing the knight to f5 fork, and also stopping the black king from running away in some lines. Though, of course, the immediate knight f5 was also very strong. So rook takes e7, and now knight h5, again a very powerful move. Realizing that, okay, the idea of e7 was actually to leave the f6 pawn undefended. So after king h8, bishop at g7, king g8. Well, now white has the option to take on f6 without any interference. And in the game, again, white played very directly with the move knight takes f6. Okay, sure, perhaps a more practical move is just to play something like bishop takes c5, and just sort of take the material in hand, saying, okay, if you get the rook, you've got a rook at h8 mate. I think that's probably the most straightforward, because also after pawn at d6, we see it after bishop ch6, it's very hard for black to stop knight takes f6. So I could even just play purely for the initiative here, but instead he went for knight f6 and said, okay, I'm going to figure out the forced mate. So after bishop h6, black played king takes f6, and after bishop cg5, this is where we have the, well, very beautiful king hunt that you also often see in Crazyhouse. If black were to play king e5, I don't think there's a forced mate, but the simple bishop e7, it's going to be decisive, because you can see that there are no good checks for black to drop, all the knight squares are covered, and queen e7, rook e4 will allow white to get the queen that he needs to basically have a decisive attack, because black is not able to drop the massive piece in his hand in time to defend in such a position. So in the game we had king g6, white played pawn h5, king f5, and well, the game went on for a very long time from here actually. We had bishop takes e7, which is the right move to, well, for the reason we saw before, that you do need the rook in hand for the attack, with g4 and so forth. So black played knight at e2, kind of trying to deflect the bishop away, so that when black does take, he's not going to get made so easily when he has some room to run with the king in different directions. Now I played move rook to f4, which is still good enough, but I think that the most clinical would have been just to play either rook to g5 here, and just say, well, okay, you have to give up your queen, and with a queen in hand, it should be enough to win. Obviously it helps that, after knight h3, check gh3, that there isn't really a good follow-up. Black might have a lot of pieces in hand, but if he does try to drop pieces on the board to get an attack, like, let's say, rook g2, we can see it kind of runs out of ammunition, where, you don't have a check on h4, f4, e3, or even really e1. Like, you go knight e1, you just take, and, black just has nothing here, where all these different pieces, bishop at e4, just put something on f3, and black has nothing here. Also, the move knight at g3 is probably also quite practical, because it kind of forces you to basically win the queen. You can even meet king d6 with knight f5, so it's kind of obvious that, well, with the queen in hand, that black can't really survive with the king in the open center. So those are both probably more convincing than move rook f4, but do keep in mind, as you can see, that white was starting it quite low on time here, which obviously influenced the quality of the play a bit as well. So I played knight c4, which was a very good move, and then bishop f3. You can see he's continuing to attack. And well, king e6 would run into rook e4, and white would again win the queen. And so a very safe king. So black plays pawn at e4, rook e4. And after knight d4, this is a point where actually JannLee found a very nice mating idea with the move rook takes d4, which actually is a lot better than the move rook e7, which, okay, turns out actually it runs into mate if you take the queen, because it takes, and, well, it's a nice combination to show just for instructional value that after king h1, pawn at g2, and then knight at f4, that, well, black is going to get in a very decisive check on this g2 square, or let's say, if you were to play bishop takes f4, well, then you have king g3, and you can see here after queen g5, and then next move piece on h4, that this is just going to be mate as such. So unfortunately white avoided this, and he played the move rook takes d4 instead. And it's sort of a point where I think, yeah, the time just became a big factor, because obviously it's kind of a bit of a random time scramble at the end. But there are a few ways for black to mate, but the fastest one is to play pawn at c3. And if black plays king at c4, takes c4, just go knight at a3, and then just go king d3 and rook d1 and pawn drops and take on d2 mate is the way to finish. That would have been the logical end to the game, but in the end it was a bit of a crazy time scramble with knight to e3, which obviously now it's kind of it's not so worthwhile to analyze the rest of the game, but I'll show you the moves just to kind of see how white actually won. Then knight d4, and you can see white's doing a good job of playing a lot of unexpected moves to run black down on the clock, because then you have a few seconds that just comes down to trying to not allow the opponent to move quickly. And you can do it by playing some sort of check, but at the highest levels, you're going to see players are probably going to pre-move moves like king d7 and king e8 and just try to avoid pre-move checks to try to flag that way. So at bishop g4, it's playing to stop the king running, basically, as an anti-pre-move, which worked quite well in that black spent a bit more time on his move. So rook d4, cd4, and I'm quite impressed how well white was able to play this almost just pre-moving. I guess it does have a 2-second increment, and that does make quite a big difference, and well, it's something that I kind of forgot about when I was recording this game, because JannLee does like to play with 2-second increment 3+2 nowadays, because he used to be very strong in fast bullet. But anyway, after king e8, pawn f7, well, it's kind of all over at this point. f8 equals queen, and even though black has a lot of material in hand, he doesn't have what he needs for the attack. If he plays knight at e2, then king h1, and I mean, you'd need the knight on h3 for the queen g1, and knight takes f2 main combination to work here. So game ended queen e8, queen at e7, very nice move. Take, king e7, then queen e6, and of course king f8, queen f7 is mate. So game went king d8, queen d7, checkmate, and well, that was the end of a very exciting, very sharp, dynamic game. And this one really does show JannLee in his element, where he was very good at kind of understanding the position and sort of emphasizing the attack over the material, and then he calculated very well in order to run the black king, into the center, where, I mean, even without finding the fastest mate, he still had a decisive attack, where black was not able to defend his king and get his pieces on the board. When you look at the material in black's hand, like 3 bishops, 4 pawns, 2 rooks, and a queen, well, that tells you the extent of white's initiative in this game. Anyway, so make sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, or if you learned something new. Also, consider subscribing to stay up to date with more of my chess videos, and I will see you in the next training video. Good luck in your Crazyhouse games, dear chess friends.